Hi, everybody. I'm afraid I'm not going to be as organized and systematic as Isaac here. So my comments are more of impressionistic nature. And I'll tell you that I'm Russian, as you can probably tell from my accent, but I came to the United States first in 1991. And I made the academic kind of career. And then the last job, I was a dean of college education in Rhode Island College. And then Isaac recruited me to come back to Russia. So those of you who are immigrants, you probably know we all have this dream of like going back and starting over. So I can tell you all about how that works. So I'm back again in the United States. I spent 3.5 years, was very fortunate to work at Higher School of Economics. Isaac was my boss. I've learned a lot from him. But I think I have my lenses. I can kind of compare the American and the Russian academia. So when I'm answering questions, I'll try to kind of apply that. I agree with Isaac that the way that the power operates on higher education in Russia is a soft kind of way of doing, which doesn't mean that it's not very effective. I'll tell you a couple of stories. Here's one story. We had this, in Higher School of Economics, we had the Academic Council, which is like highest governing body of the university with maybe 130 people or so. So we're sitting there and our rector, very well respected, Yaroslav Kuzminov, asking people, when talking to somebody on mass media, would you please, when you're like dissidents and you're against the power, would you please not affiliate yourself and just say, yeah, I'm so and so. And then, of course, the academics started all complaining about it, the freedom and all of them. And then he said, well, okay, you'll have a different rector then. And that kind of quieted down the conversation right then, because the rectors are appointed in our case, by actually by the federal government. And I suspect the similar mechanism of influence work in other universities as well. Somebody who can be dismissed at will, that kind of, if you like that person, kind of helps you to keep your rhetoric down. And was there a censorship like that? Yeah, there's another example. We had a lot of work with the Federal Ministry of Education. So that's not sort of political pressure as much as sort of economic dependency. So neither of us at the top sort of leadership of the institute thought it was wise to publicly criticize the Ministry of Education. So is this not the direct influence? They never told us, shut up and don't criticize us. But in effect, that's what's going on. Now, I have to say that this mechanism are not very different than in the United States. When I was in Rhode Island, I published a blog which was somewhat critical, very polite, but critical to our state superintendent of public education. So my president got a call, and I got a call from the president, so I had to remove the blog, right? Because I was dean. I wasn't like just a faculty member. So it's a very different relationship there. Again, there is nothing unique about those technologies of power. It's just Russians use them like everybody else. Now, I have to make sure that you understand that in Russian higher education system, the Higher School of Economics, Moscow State, and a few other universities are in a very, very, very different category than the vast majority of other schools. And the relationship with power, with authority, with governmental authority is very different. If you're a rector of some regional university, you're much more vulnerable to direct administrative pressure. Don't say that, say this. I also have to say that the federal government also applies different ways of kind of pressuring people. For example, the Russian Ministry of Education has a regular meeting of what would be equivalent of deans of students. You probably attended some of them. So in those meetings, they will say things like, oh, there are some street protests. How do we make sure our students don't come there? So it's kind of scholarly conversation, right? If you don't do anything about that, they're not going to fire you. But there is still this kind of gentle pressure. I think in some parts of the government, there's still illusion that you can actually control what students think. Now, people who are more wise, who've been in higher ed for a while, they know that none of that really works, because we all went through the Soviet experience where there was attempts to directly control student thoughts backfired on the authorities. So the new authoritarians didn't learn anything from that. So they just think it's still possible. I have to say not all of them. Now, I'm not a political scientist, but I think the kind of the species of nationalism that is in Russia are somewhat different than the one that is prevalent, and not prevalent, but is emerging in, for example, United States or Europe. It's not that new, that kind of breed of nationalism. It's fairly old. And it operates, I think what Putin and his government discovered is really what Nixon's Southern strategy was. So if you appeal to the sort of massive prejudice and kind of conservative social majority, then you can get votes and get elected. And also what they discovered, also there are ways to manufacture more of the conservative thoughts. Which I think is very interesting, and I think we have to recognize that we live in a very different informational world. We kind of passed the age of mass media, and we're in the age of social media, which turned out to be very different. I mean, none of us were prepared to deal with that. I was in Russia for 3.5 years, right? So I saw how the Russian Facebook, which was very lively and active and very political, over the 3 years, gradually the space of free thought was shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. So the Russians didn't do what the Chinese do. They didn't erect a cyber wall. Instead, they hired hundreds of trolls that would kind of infiltrate it from inside and kind of gradually dampen the activity on social media. And also, what they figure out is that you don't have to imprison many people. You just imprison 1 or 2 for reposting something on Facebook, and suddenly everybody is less willing to criticize the government. So again, this phenomenon is actually common. There's nothing unique about that. It may have like some of this kind of the first shot of this social media information wars may be fired in Russia, but we absolutely has no unique knowledge of that or monopoly on that technology. In fact, if you look at sort of the alt-right American movement and the Russians, so there's some debate about the degree of influence, but I think it's clear to me that they're akin and they use the same methodologies of influencing public consciousness. Now, going back to the government, I think it's important to understand that in Russian context, the governments, both the federal and the regional, and they're not solid. I mean, it's very complex, actually, kind of a compromise. There are still very strong modernization kind of wing. You can call them liberal or modernization wing. Those are people who are still hoping to push forward the modernization, economy and social modernization agenda. And they are still fairly successful. And maybe it's not visible, but what Isaac was telling about the program for the University Excellence Initiatives is an example of a very successful thing, which was happening at the same time as this country was kind of turning down more nationalistic. And there are a few other examples where it still works. So, well, anyway, I'm not going to go into details, but you need to understand that there's always universities that are very powerful, like Higher School of Economics, right? They have the friends in the government, and they have also bitter enemies in the same government. So their ability to survive and to kind of flourish depends on their kind of knowledge of how the politics works. And I'm not talking about public politics. I'm talking about the internal politics of fairly authoritarian overall regime. So I don't think there is any way to trace the impact on curriculum that the nationalism has. I'm sure it does exist, though, because especially if you go to regional universities, there are a lot of students who have this kind of patriotic, nationalistic, brainwashed, I would say, outlook on the world. And of course, their professors cannot be constantly antagonizing them. So you kind of have to, even if you personally are more liberal, you have to kind of adjust to that situation. Again, that's not that different when I was teaching in Northwest Ohio. Do you know what I mean? It's like, do you want to alienate all your students, or you just want to kind of teach them something? I think there is we all need to kind of face that There was a writer, Richard Hofstadter is his name. He wrote a very famous essay. I'm out of time?
Yeah,
yeah. Okay, all right. Sorry, yeah. So it's called Paranoid Style in American Politics. So if you haven't read it, take a look at it. Because his theory is that the paranoid mind is very, very old phenomenon. It looks like the social media gave it, the old virus, sort of a new vehicle to spread, right? And I really don't think we can battle it with more critical thinking. If you look at paranoics, they're the most critically thinking people you can find. They have references, they have thick books, they always cite some evidence and all of that. So I don't think that's the case. So our students in higher school of economics, they're immune to it because they trust us. So we really need to teach students to trust somebody, because you can't really weigh all the evidence that is available.